Hello, I'm Anna Evans from Indigo House, and I'm very glad to be contributing to the CASH Scottish Housing Policy Conference today. And I'm joined with my colleagues, Briege Nugent, Mandy Littlewood, and Dr. John Boyle. And we're all involved in the RentBetter research programme, which is funded by the Nationwide Foundation. We've been asked to contribute to the part of the conference to do with demand and supply. But first of all, I'm going to go through the first part of the research that we completed in 2020. So I'm just going to start by putting up a slide deck, and then the second part of the presentation, we're going to have a discussion about wave 2, which is underway at the moment. So I'm just going to share my screen and get the presentation up. So sorry, bear with me. Okay, so the title of our presentation is Getting the Right Balance, and we're going to look at opinion from tenants and landlords. As I've said today, my colleagues Briege, Mandy and John are here, but also in the RentBetter research team, Emma Dorr, Regina Serpa, Eddie Graham and Douglas Robertson. And everybody has slightly different roles to play through the course of it. So I'm going to speak 5 minutes about wave 1, just to give context to our discussion later on, and then move on to our early findings of wave 2, which are not published yet. So just a quick skip through what RentBetter is all about. It's a 3-year study now extended due to COVID to understand the impacts of tenancy reform in Scotland. And a key aim for Nationwide Foundation is to provide learning to help shape any further Scottish reforms, but also to share lessons learned across the UK, especially the Renters Reform Bill that will be going through Westminster at some point. It has been delayed. RentBetter and Nationwide Foundation's focus is on those who struggle more in the private rented sector. So we're focusing on affordability and tenancy, security of tenure, access to justice, and especially for low income groups, those in housing need. But right from the start, from our proposal and through wave 1, and we'll continue through the whole part, we're very keen to get a balanced picture. So we're speaking to tenants and landlords to understand the whole market and what's going on. So wave 1, as I've said, was reported in 2020. There was a large quantitative survey, and there was secondary data analysis and qualitative work with tenants, landlords and stakeholders. And we're now on to wave 2, which is mainly qualitative with secondary data. I'm not going to go through the detail of this. I'm sure most of the people attending the conference will be familiar with the private residential tenancy, but it's there for your information. But a key thing to point out is the open-ended nature now of the tenancy and 28 days notice. Rent increases is relevant, especially with the proposals coming out from Scottish Government. The PRT introduced no more than 1 increase every 12 months. And there were various other mechanisms to assess affordability. From the landlord's point of view, the eviction proceedings are said to be simplified. There's no fault ground, and there's a longer notice period from landlords. Also, Nationwide Foundation has asked us to look at the impact of the coronavirus emergency legislation in wave 2. This is really to emphasise how diverse the private rented sector is. Nearly two-thirds of private renters work full-time, medium income of about 1,800, but a huge range from 200 to £4,500 pounds per month. And the rents can vary very widely as well. So an average when we were doing wave 1 of £809 per month, but some markets are lowest rents are in line with social rents. So particularly in the Ayrshires, there's very low rent market in the private rented sector, and then very high rents in Edinburgh. There's also about a quarter of private renters claim either housing benefit or universal credit, and there's a wide variation reflecting the markets of those that use housing benefit in the private rent sector, and that chart there shows you the wide range. It is generally a transitional market, although there is a trend to longer periods, but it is, compared to other tenures, it is transitional. And access is more difficult for single people, single parents, those on lower incomes, and disabled people, and people from Black minority ethnics backgrounds. So those with less power find access more difficult in the private rented sector. Tenant security, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but the findings from wave one is that in general, there's a lack of awareness from tenants on their rights. They might not know what tenancy they are on, and they don't know what their rights are. And yet tenants have a high level of confidence generally that they'll be able to stay in their tenancy as long as they meet their deal of the contract. And regardless of tenancy type, they feel they are secure. But that security tends to be associated also with affordability and trust in the landlord. And this part of the work kind of started emergence of the concept of and the importance of relationships between tenant and landlords and individual relationships. We also found that landlords are generally better informed about rights and responsibilities, but still some are vague. Rents. Now here we can see that over 2/5 of private rented tenants pay under 30% on rent, but probably concerningly is that over 50% pay over 30%, and there's some kind of eye-watering figures there, 8% over 50%. Now, in wave one, there were some kind of confusing messages that we got from tenants, and it seems that there might be a situation where people have grown to expect to pay very high rents. And so that's an area that we have been exploring in further depth in wave two, just around the rents versus affordability, and what people are able and willing to pay. But very importantly as well, I think with the Scottish Government policy proposals coming out is about frequency of rent increases. And what we found in wave one is, both from landlords and tenants, is that there generally are infrequent rent increases when in a tenancy, but landlords tend to take the opportunity to increase rents, if they do at all, only when the tenancy changes over. We also explored leavers and stayers, and who out of landlords were tend to want to leave the market and who wanted to stay. And a quarter of the landlords that we spoke to said that they were considering selling all of their properties and exiting entirely. But the highest proportion of those who responded to the survey said they planned no change at all. But there was this sense of a cumulative impact of legislative change having a more negative impact on the smaller cottage industry type landlords. But there is a tension there between those probably being the landlords that are providing the better service and more of a direct relationship with tenants, and provides more satisfaction for tenants. So when we came to the end of wave one, we put forward 3 hypotheses that we would explore further in wave two, and these are listed here. Affordability, i.e. tenants have low expectations of affordability, and especially in high rent markets. So we're exploring that. I've just completed our interviews exploring that. In terms of justice, dispute resolution tends to be more favourable from landlords with small, probably less than 5 properties. And in terms of leavers and stayers, landlords with 5 or less properties in their portfolio are more likely to leave the sector. So you can see the tension there in terms of the more favourable landlord for tenants on one hand, but perhaps these are the ones that are more likely to be leaving the sector. So that's just a skip through wave one, and just to give wave two some context. So I'm now going to go on to some discussion. And on the demand side, I'm going to ask Briege to join us. And then after a discussion with Briege, we'll talk about supply with Mandy and John. So Briege, could you put up your video on, and we can have a discussion. And I'll also X out of this. Right, okay. Sorry, give me a moment. So have you got your, yes, you've got your mute off. This is all fun and games. Right, so could you just take us through the main circumstances? Well, first of all, I think it's first important to emphasise that we have been speaking to tenants who tend to be in the lower end of the market. They're people on low income, they're in housing need. Other criteria are that they might be disabled and might be from BME ethnic backgrounds, or might have had some kind of impact from the pandemic. So those are the kind of key criteria that we've got in our sampling. So can you just take us through what the key circumstances that tenants have been experienced? And you've spoken to over 60 tenants, that's worth emphasising as well.
Yeah, so I suppose the key word here actually is struggling. Half are reliant on housing benefit, and for those that are working, they're basically in low pay and precarious work, and some were in self-employment, so same type of precarity, and many were single mothers, and half of those interviewed were affected by the pandemic financially, so the precarious work disappearing during that time and having to then go on to benefits in some cases for the first time. A third reported also having a disability and the complexity that goes with that, and described, having to apply for disability benefit and the stress that brought with it. And a quarter also were from rural areas, and they basically talked about how they're just really struggling to find a place at all and very concerned about the continuing rise in rents where they live.
Okay, and what about their experience? What's their general view of private renting, and what the relationships like that they have with landlords?
So on the whole, the past experience they described was mixed, but I would say it was tending towards negative. And people reported basically having to hassle their landlord for things. Repairs in particular were a real issue. And some of them were very serious. And there seemed to be a lot of cases where there was damp, mold and things like that growing on walls, but the landlord was saying that they're not ventilating the property right. And they were saying that there's no way of having the ventilation. So there was a lot of backwards and forwards and nothing getting done. Also had situations where tenants were saying they've actually stopped hassling the landlord and are doing things themselves, or they've stopped hassling the landlord because they're worried that if they continue to report the things that are actually problematic, their rents might be increased. And what I did find was that the cases where there was a good relationship with the landlord, they tend to have a quicker response. So repairs were done quickly. So it just follows on from what you were describing that we found in wave one. The only notable difference is that some landlords, there was a small number of landlords in the rural areas where that wasn't the case. So even though they were well known to each other, the repairs were still outstanding. So generally, really quite negative experiences that we're getting from across the group of people that we're interviewing.
And was there any difference in the size of landlords? So, smaller landlords versus larger portfolios and perhaps letting agents experiences?
Yeah, just what you described actually. So those that had smaller number of properties in their portfolio, it seemed that they had a better experience with their tenants, and it seemed like the bigger the estate agent or the letting agent and the bigger the portfolio, the less personal the service was, and the less the service kind of decreased in terms of how satisfied people were.
Okay, so one of the main themes that we've been looking into is affordability, which is probably one of the most important aspects in the Scottish Government consultation paper coming up. So can you tell us a bit more about the stories from tenants around the proportion of incomes that tenants are paying on rent versus kind of like what their expectations are and trade-offs that they have to make?
Yeah, so affordability, I completely agree with you. I think for me, it would be the biggest key finding in this study, just the struggle that people are having to kind of cope in terms of making rent. And actually their expectations are just what you described in the first wave. They've got low expectations about what actually they can get, and they're expecting high rents. So we have a lot of people reporting paying half, and in some cases 2/3 of their income towards rent, and they're expecting to do that, and they're making their rent at the cost of other things. So I've had quite a few people discussing, going to food banks, or in some cases because they feel too stigmatized to go to food banks, using their credit card to even just tide things over to get food and just the basics. And in the rural areas, they were talking about how it's rare as hen's teeth actually getting places. So affordability for them is a real issue. So yeah, I think that just the extent, you could call it eye water and figures, the extent that people are expecting to pay these figures it's really concerning, actually.
And that's presumably to do with choice as well. There's not a great choice there. They have to make trade-offs, and you have to go for what they can get in terms of rent.
Yeah, you mentioned trade-offs there, and actually when I asked that question, people almost kind of laughed, because they were saying that actually for my budget, it is just what I can get. So it's not that I'm not going in with a tick list of things to get. So one of the men I interviewed, I said to him, what trade-offs have you had? Some people are saying about big kitchen, and he laughed. He was like, look, that's not even something I would think about. It's just, does it even have a place I can cook basic food? That's enough for me. And just some of the stories, like I interviewed one woman she described how it was the first time she'd slept in a bed in 3 years, because she can only afford to rent a 2-bedroom flat, and she's got she's got 2 daughters, teenage daughters, and 1 teenage son. So she sleeps on the sofa so that they have a room each. And she said it was the first time she slept in a bed in 3 years. And it's just shocking that this is the situation people are putting up with and expecting.
And what do you think the people experiences around rent increases are? Do they happen annually or not? And did people talk about the level of rent increases if they did have rent increases while they were in their tenancy?
So rent increases actually across our group were rare. We just had a couple of people say that they've gone up, around 5% every couple of years, and they expected those rental increases, so that be negotiated with the landlord in advance. There was one woman who lived in a rural area who had lived there for many years, considered her home, and she said that the next rental increase will definitely mean that she can no longer afford to live there. And there was one other man who took rental increases that had happened in Edinburgh twice. He had 2 rental increases in a year, so he took it to the tribunal. And they were small increases, like about 5% of what he was paying, but there were 2 increases in a year. We took it to tribunal, and they said that actually the rental increases were fair when you compared it to what the rent was across the location where he was living, and which he felt was really unfair because of the fact that it was quite quick succession in which it happened.
even though it was two rental increases. Okay.
Yeah.
But overall, you're saying that rent increases in tenancies are rare.
Yeah, that's what we have found.
But nevertheless, for people on low incomes, it's very difficult when they do happen.
Yeah, I think just the reality is they're living on a knife edge. Every penny is being accounted for. So that 5% increase might sound small to us, but actually is a massive amount of money to people who are really struggling.
Great. Okay, Briege, thanks. That's very, very helpful. I'm going to go on now and ask Mandy and John to join the conversation. And we're going to talk about the other side of the equation. So we've had a bit of a flavour of demand at the lower end of the market from Briege. And I've been interviewing some of the landlords and letting agents on the supply side. So 48 landlords and letting agents. I haven't interviewed them all. So Emma and Regina have also been involved in that. And we've been talking about lots of things, but one of the themes that we've been covering is leavers and stayers. So who's going to leave, who's going to stay, and why? And I think what we found is broadly there's an equal split between the leavers and stayers. So I mean, this is qualitative rather quantitative, but from those that we've been talking to this wave, there's a higher proportion of leavers than wave 1 survey, but obviously it's much smaller number. And that might reflect, kind of bit of probable opt-in bias of people who want to speak to us. But the leavers are planning to leave, say over the next 5 years, and they tend to be on average about 5-6 properties or less, a few with bigger portfolios. And the main reason they're wanting to leave the market is because of, they say, the weight of regulation, exposing them to unacceptable levels of risk, the financial risk associated with that as well, prospect of more increased regulation, and what some people call the so-called political agenda. Energy requirements is a big deal for a lot of landlords, especially those with tenements and in rural areas with old stone properties, say that it's just not feasible to reach the EPC levels. And also student accommodation is obviously a sub-market which has been impacted by the PRT, so people are leaving that. Interesting letting agents saying that there's a mix of landlords leaving and staying, but importantly, some consider that there aren't increasing levels of leavers, but there are not the same level of entrants coming into the market, which they felt was concerning. So, and this all varies by types of markets, but it's that point that people aren't, entering the market. There aren't new entrants coming in compared to previously. So, Mandy, your work on the secondary data analysis, maybe you can just talk us through what the data is telling us on stock trends, and what do we know, well, what the source is, and what do we know, and what the challenges around that.
Thanks, Anna. I suppose one of the key messages to get across for Wave 2 is the extremely challenging nature of the data at the moment because of COVID-19, and that has had an impact on sources of data, one of them being the Scottish Household Survey, which has always been one of our prime sources of information. So that's a big challenge for us. So what we did see up until very recently was a significant growth in private renting from 5% in 1999 to up to 15% in 2017. And since then, there's been more evidence of a kind of falling back in the private rented sector. Again, from the Scottish Household Survey in 2018, we see 14% of households renting, and the same in 2019 Scottish Household Survey. But the latest data we have on properties, that's the number of dwellings in the private rented sector, is quite old now. It's from March 2018, and that put the size of the stock at about 370,000 properties. The information we have from 2018 onwards is a little bit more sketchy because it's not an official estimate. The 2019 Scottish Household Survey puts the proportion of households at 14, and the 2020 estimates also put the proportion of households at 14%. But that last estimate is based on a telephone survey. The Scottish Household Survey had to come off face-to-face onto telephone, and that's had impacts on its quality, the number of interviews, and there had to be a weighting process, and they compared the household survey estimates from previous years and other data with landlord registration data, and they concluded that they felt it was still about 14%. But we just don't have a current accurate figure of, we had 370,000, or we estimated that in 2018. What is it now? Looking at recent landlord registration data suggests that although we would expect the number of properties to be increasing because the number of dwellings and the number of households have increased by the 2020 household and dwelling estimates, we'd expect to see private renting increasing as well if it was staying in proportion. But what we're seeing in the landlord registration data over the past wee while is a reduction, and there's been 8,000 property reduction in the past 2 years. So by 2021, in December, there were just under 340,000 properties on the landlord registration data, which that 8,000 is a 2% reduction in the space of 2 years, which is not massive and within what we might expect in terms of survey estimates. But when you think that what we should be seeing is an increase in properties to keep up with the increase in households, it does start to show some concerns that there may not be enough stock around. But it is this difference between properties and households. We have a good household estimate, but we have a poor property estimate, and we need to know that there are more properties than there are households, because we need that gap, which is what John's data from CityLet tells us a bit about that gap, but we're really lacking information about that.
Okay, thanks, Mandy. That's helpful. John, I don't know if you want to come at it as well on stock about your on the ground experience at Retties and Co, and what you think the key issues are on stock of PRS dwellings.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've seen in recent years is available supply of stock coming onto the market has clearly been drying up. You can see that from the CityLet's data. You can also see it from the RentMove data. There's been something of a plunge in supply in recent years. And you know, that kind of preceded SPRT coming in 2017, but it's continued on a downward trajectory really ever since. Now, some of this is landlords exiting the sector, you know, and it's not just due to the changes in regulation brought about by SPRT, but also loss of mortgage relief and additional dwelling supplement also coming in, which you know might have a deterrent effect for new entrants coming into the sector, because they're having to pay an additional charge on their LBTT of 4%. So some landlords, I think, exited the sector. Some moved to the short-term let sector, which was until recently relatively unregulated and high demand, particularly in tourist areas. So you know, Edinburgh and parts of Glasgow, parts of the Highlands. Some landlords have just left the PRS altogether and have sold up. We know that because we see that on the agency and on the asset management side within Retties. Now, the regulation, the new legislation in the short-term let sector, which is coming through, I think will see a number of properties return to the traditional PRS, but not all of them that's been lost. So places like Edinburgh have seen a very sharp increase in demand for housing stock, including PRS stock, due to rapid rises in immigration to the city over the last 20 years. But if anything, from data that we've looked at over the last 5 to 10 years, PRS stock, which should have been increasing to meet this increased demand, has actually been reduced, and therefore we've got price pressures within the market. Demand has also been buoyant post-pandemic, and I think this has also impacted on the availability of stock. Property has been snapped up much more quickly. The race for space that we're seeing within the sales market, that's also evident within the lettings market. And then there's the concern about what the broader policy strategy agenda is from the Scottish Government. You know, if it's to actively reduce the PRS over time, then again, that's going to affect new entrants coming into the market. This includes institutional investors who are in Scotland, and BTR is getting off the ground. We're seeing some large sites now being completed, but many of the institutional investors remain quite nervous about Scotland. Some of the big funds don't have Scotland on the radar at all. There's a fear about rent controls and additional regulation. And BTR is really, you know, a way in which we can get new supply into the sector very quickly, and a way to mitigate price pressures. Just finally, student market. I think it's undoubtedly been hit by the SPRT changes. Many of us warned, you know, within the PRS sector, many of us warned that this was going to be the case, you know, because landlords used to rent to students and take the property back in the summer. They can't do this now. Many left the student PRS to rent to, you know, young professionals all year round, and so maintain their yield. There's a lot of students still, although they've got alternatives, but they want to be in the PRS because the flexibility and the value for money it offers compared to some of those alternatives, but they're finding properties difficult to come by, and what is available is ramping up in price due to this demand supply imbalance. And I think, you know, the way things are at the moment, that's a problem that's likely to worsen.
Great, thanks, John. Well, we are not at the stage of having firm conclusions yet on wave 2. We've got tons of data to go through and analyse and write up. We should be publishing sometime April, May, just in time for the deadline of the consultation, Scottish Government consultation. But I think it's absolutely clear that there's two clear sides of this story. At the lower end, and the low-income private rent is a very difficult balance to address for the needs of low-income private renters and those in housing need. On the one hand, making sure their needs are met and they get access to affordable housing, but also ensure that the market doesn't react negatively, either because of financial drivers, tax, or regulation isn't suiting them and thereby increasing prices or choosing to leave altogether. Because I think we're clear in the team that we need the private rented sector. It has an important role. It can be very positive, but it's just getting that right balance between demand and supply and making sure that market is working effectively. So thank you very much, everybody, for your contributions, and thanks to the Cash again for inviting us, and good luck with the rest of your conference. Thank you. Bye-bye.